So we talked about paraphrasing. Now let's talk about direct quotations. So direct quotation reproduces words from a source verbatim. So we don't, like we saw in the last set of slides, we don't provide direct quotations all of the time, only in rare situations. So we'll provide direct quotations when, one, an author's word choice is memorable or particularly succinct. So particularly succinct might be like the group author that we saw in the last example. There was no other way to describe that term other than without getting it really wordy and verbose. We can use direct quotations when the author themselves is well known and an authority on the topic, and boom, that was the example that I came up with at the beginning of this presentation deck, right? So we were talking about the APA is the authority on this subject, and so rather than just paraphrasing what they said, I wanted to give you guys like a taste of their specific language. So sometimes there's going to be moments where maybe one of the, for the literature review, for example, maybe somebody is like a pioneer in the field and they discovered these really key things about the subject. So that might be an author where you make an exception and provide a direct quotation because their words ended up being so influential on the field in the years after they said them. You'll use direct quotations when you want to respond to another author. Now, in this assignment, the literature review, right, you're not providing opinion or interpretation or kind of like making an argument at all, right? So in this assignment, we're not really going to do any of this third example. So really, the only times that you would be using direct quotations in this class, at least for this literature review assignment, would be either of these first two examples. So that's not going to be all the time. That'll be pretty rare, I would say. So here's some more from the textbook. Again, the authority on the topic is telling us a little bit more about the difference between when to quote and when to paraphrase. And they say, it is best to paraphrase sources rather than directly quoting them because paraphrasing allows you to fit material to the context of your paper and writing style. Nothing is more insufferable. I say that with total love and sympathy for the writing process that students go through trying to understand these complex documents. But nothing is more just inscrutable than trying to read a paper where every other sentence is a quote from a different author, where you're kind of like making a collage of this person said this and that person said that and this person said this. Like, that's cool that they all said this, but like this is like I'm getting whiplash here trying to connect these pieces together. And that's, again, this is that that iron imperative: treat the reader's time as more valuable than your own, right? Your job is to let the authors speak through you, if that makes sense. Take that information and let it serve your goal of explaining to the reader the state of the research, rather than letting it speak for itself and like you staying out of the mess. You don't want to provide your opinion. You stay out of the conversation in that way, but you don't stay out of the writing. Like, you've got to do the writing. So that's where the paraphrasing comes in. And just think about how much of a benefit that is when I'm reading something and the words have been shaped to match, to coalesce together, so that I can understand how this author's words and this author's ideas, how these kind of fit together in the bigger picture. So that's kind of what we're doing with the synthesis paragraph this week, and with the whole task of the literature review, is making a delicious, I just think of like a cheese dip with like tomatoes and beans, and everything's just melting together in there, right? You're not going to eat those things separately. You're going to mix them all together in a nice slow cooker, and then just like dip some chips in there, and then it's going to come right out perfectly. I don't know if that was a great metaphor, but hopefully that made sense. So in those rare moments where we do need to quote directly, then you're going to include the author, the year, and the page number of the quotation in your in-text citation. Remember, we said when you're paraphrasing a specific part of a source, you provide that page number in addition to the author and the year. Well, when you're quoting, clearly you're pointing to a specific part of a source. So every time you quote, 100% of the time, you do need to provide that page number. So here's an example. If a reference has a group author, the name of the group can sometimes be abbreviated. So that's my quote, right? And then I've got in parentheses APA, comma 2017, comma P period 268. For a narrative citation, it might look like this, and this is funky. So like take notes like as we go through this. So according to the APA 2017, if a reference has a group author, the name of the group can sometimes be abbreviated, page 268. So remember I said earlier, the name of the author and the year always go side by side. So when you have a narrative citation, it's going to look like this, right? They appear before, it may be before, maybe after, you could say maybe according to afterwards, but it's usually going to appear before the quote. And so just the same way that the name of the author and the year appear side by side, the quote and the page number should appear side by side. So that's kind of a way to think about that, is when you finish a quote, you need to put the page number right after it for a narrative citation. The other thing you may have noticed about this example is the brackets here. Now notice that this has a small I, and then in the original sentence, we have a large I. You may have noticed this before if you read like newspapers or magazines or blogs or anything like that. If we're quoting a source and we change something about the quote, then we will put brackets and replace what a word or a phrase or a letter with something that's going to make it make sense in the context that we're fitting it into, if that makes sense. So we don't do this a lot, and you don't want to do this. This is a kind of a risky choice to make if you're replacing entire words or phrases. But sometimes you need to do that. You might need to do like a bracket with a dot dot dot, because maybe in the original quote there was a little aside, maybe that's like 40 or 50 words long, where the author went into some thing that was really interesting in the original example, but is not necessary for your reader. And also, if we remove that portion and just replace it with a dot dot dot, it doesn't detract from the meaning. It doesn't change the meaning or alter the meaning of the original in any way. So if that's the case, then we can do that. But so what you wouldn't do, like, so if, for example, if you had a sentence that had not in it, you would not want to replace the word not with dot, 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 so that you can make it say the opposite of what it's supposed to say. Like, that's the worst thing you could do as a researcher. But in case you're wondering, like, how does these bracket things work? Like that, there's rules about when you do that and when you don't do that. So, but in this case, if we have that capital I there, it wouldn't make sense in this new context, because this is in the middle of a sentence, not at the beginning of a sentence. So that I should be lowercase here. So that's why we got the lowercase I in the brackets. But yeah, so whenever you quote, you will always provide, like I said, the author, the year, and the page number. But if you're doing a narrative citation, just remember the name of the author goes side by side with the year, and the page number always goes immediately after the end of the quote. One other thing, there's sometimes going to be a quote where, let's say this starts on page 268, but then the page runs out and then the rest of the quote finishes on page 269. Then in that case, you wouldn't put P period 268, but you would put PP period 268-269. Doesn't happen very often, but that's the rule. If the work does not have page numbers, you'll provide another way for the reader to locate the quotation, and you can take a look at section 828, 8.28, and it'll have more information about that for you. Okay, so that brings us to the end here. So here at the end, I just want to kind of touch on kind of like, what is the takeaway? Like, why do we care about this, or why is it important to paraphrase more than quote? This is something that most of your instructors, whether they say it specifically or not, this is what they expect from college writing. That may not have been expected in high school writing, or maybe not even in English 101. I don't know if you guys have watched the movie Doctor Strangelove or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, but when I was coming up with this, I just thought this is exactly the sentiment, is how I learned to stop quoting and love the paraphrase. um, I really think it's just like a paradigm shift for a lot of students to think this way about research and writing. You know, you're referring to a lot of sources in your literature review, and so there are different reasons why you may want to quote rather than paraphrase. So here's one reason. So sometimes students prefer quoting because they just don't fully understand the original. And I get it. I sympathize with that. I experienced that. You know, just because I'm a professor doesn't mean that I understand everything the first time I read it. When I read a research article, like we were talking about last week, I don't necessarily just, you know, read through as though I'm, you know, reading the Sunday newspaper and just like have a walk in the park with it. The first time I read something, I'm confused. I don't really understand. I have to kind of set it down, come back to it, and really kind of wrap my head around it several times before I can really start to understand. I might need to talk to other professionals in the field to understand the material. I might need to do a Wikipedia search to understand certain terms that are coming up, etc. That's totally normal, but that's not an excuse to quote. Like that's a reason to do more work before you set yourself to the task of doing the writing, before doing the paraphrasing. So use your dictionary, use Wikipedia, use any material sources at your availability so that you can either understand if there's vocabulary words, if there are heavy concepts or theories or constructs that you're not familiar with. You've got to understand those before you can write about what they mean, right? You've got to understand. And so sometimes students will, if it's really difficult or whatever, rather than taking the time to take those steps, you know, look it up and get more information about it, sometimes it's just easier to just copy paste, quote, boom, I'm done, like, and then I can move on. The problem is that if that becomes a habit, that's where we end up with those papers where we just got quote after quote after quote after quote, and nothing makes sense together. So we want to avoid that. Another thing that can really help is to ask knowledgeable people on the topic. That's going to help you get a grasp on the material. Definitely, if you're reading something and you don't understand what it's talking about in this class, like for our assignments, feel free to send a paragraph from your reading or whatever. Send me a document, the PDF file, and say like, hey, on this page it's talking about blah blah blah, and I'm just not understanding this section. Like, can you help me? Maybe I can give you some insight, or I probably won't know about the topic because I'm maybe not an expert in that field, whatever it is that you're researching, unless you're researching something like linguistics or something. But I might be able to help you tackle it, and I might be able to suggest ways that you can figure that out. If you know a professor or someone who works at the college or works in the industry, you might hit those people up about hey, I'm doing this assignment for my technical writing class, and this article talks about blah blah blah. Do you know what that is? Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Or can I call you sometime and we can talk about it? Like, that's a great, for one thing, for your professors and instructors, and I realize this is summer quarter right now, so they may not be as available as usual, but man, if any student from the college, any student came to me and said like, hey Tom, like I was reading about phonology and I wanted to learn more about whatever, I would love to talk to you about phonology. Like, yeah, that would be really cool. That's my jam. Like, let's talk about it. So don't hesitate to ask questions about those types of things. If you reach out to someone who, a professor or an expert in the field or whatever, and want to get more information, my only word of advice is just, like, don't expect them to do all the work for you. Tell them the work that you've done. Like, maybe frame the conversation by saying like, here's what I looked up and read about it, and this thing said that it means this, but this other thing says that it means this, and that's why I'm having a hard time understanding, like, when this author says blah blah blah, that doesn't really fit into either one of those. And so so providing that kind of like context or background, that's really going to help whoever you know, you're talking to, give you the best feedback and the best information. And that's a great way to make networking connections too, with somebody who has experience in this field that you're going to go into for work. So that's my first bit of advice. Another reason students may avoid paraphrasing: it's challenging to recast a sentence in your own words. Sometimes we may not have the language, or we may not kind of, sometimes we just kind of like get kind of stuck with the original way that we read it, and it can be really hard to break ourselves from that and just think of an original way or a different way to say it. So I encourage you guys to use the techniques that we saw in the paragraphing portion of this presentation for that. But it might also help just to remember that like challenges are good, right? Challenges result in growth. I'm not trying to talk down to you, but I just think when it comes to writing, sometimes we don't want to be challenged. We find the material, the reading is challenging enough already. I've got enough challenges in my life. I just want to get this work done. Just remember, like, your goal here is to become a stronger writer. And so mastering paraphrasing is really going to be a great skill for you to employ in any writing discipline, in any writing situation. So if you choose to quote everything in your paper, that can be really comfortable, right? I don't have to think too much about how it fits into my overall idea. I don't have to worry about making this sentence match with this sentence. I just kind of quote it all and pop it in there, and there you have it. But you know, when you're comfortable, you're not growing. So so don't take the easy way out, so to speak. And so the other thing I want to say about quoting is it feels more comfortable, and so that is it's a what's the word? It's deceptive, because it feels more comfortable, it feels safer, but it's actually riskier to quote than to paraphrase. So if the quote doesn't make sense in the context of your paper without paraphrasing, so for example, that's that, you know, quote this, quote that, quote this. The author originally was talking about that within a specific context. And so there's just individual words in that quote that they chose to use that made sense in that original context, but do not make sense in your context. And so that's why when quoting, if you can select just like 2 or 3 words, maybe like a short phrase, not an entire like 20 or 30 word sentence, because again, the context that you're writing in, you're writing like a literature review, is totally different from the context that they originally wrote it in. They were writing a specific study. And so, so that's risky, just popping it into your paper, because people aren't necessarily going to know what to do with that because it was written for a different context. You need to work it a little bit, massage it into your narrative that you're writing. Another reason it's risky if the instructor expects you to show a higher level of authority on the subject. And so, you know, that's what I was saying at the beginning, you know, it's more of like a high school thing, kind of like quoting everything in your papers. And the more you're in college, and especially certain disciplines like going into nursing, for example, I mean, they are really any APA, anybody who relies on APA formatting, all those instructors are expecting you to be paraphrasing, and being very judicious and selective about your usage of quoting. So my final comment on all of that is just remember that you are the author of your paper. Your sources are not the author of your paper. So you can have wonderful, brilliant sources that are perfect for the topic. But if you are not, if you're letting them do all the work and letting them do all the talking, it's not gonna come out right. So just take ownership of that assignment, of this assignment or any assignment that you're doing in the future in APA by paraphrasing. So that's all I've got for you guys about paraphrasing and quoting for this week. So like I said, you're going to be using this on your synthesis paragraph assignment quite a bit. You'll probably be using it for the research matrix assignment too, although you're free to paraphrase or quote or whatever you wish on that one. And so let me know if you have any questions about that. I really encourage you guys, send me your questions. I'm happy to answer through email. Happy to help you out and set up a Calendly appointment if I can help you with that as well. Thanks.